From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
As the Wizard of Oz once said, ignore the man behind the curtain. In the world of political campaigns, the almighty Oz is a candidate's campaign manager. This week, we pulled that curtain back in Republican Brendan Doherty's race for U.S. House of Representatives. Joining us in studio, campaign manager for Doherty for Congress, Ian Pryor. Then, if you're one of those people who think your vote doesn't count, consider Pawtucket House District 58. After several automated recounts, incumbent Representative William San Bento defeated challenger Carlos Tobon by one vote. One single vote. Or did he? After questions have emerged, the Rhode Island chapter of the ACLU is heading to the Supreme Court demanding a manual recount of the ballots. This week on the second half of Newsmakers, our guest, Carlos Tobon. Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nisi and Eyewitness News analyst Arlene Violet. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ian. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Good morning. I don't think I've ever been referred to as the Wizard of Oz before, but
the almighty
I'll take
Oz,
it.
I believe is how we started that. Before we get into questions, I do want to point out that we offered to have the campaign manager for Congressman David Cicilline join us on the program, and they declined the offer. Ian, no matter which poll you use, be it yours or the DCCC, the Congressman Cicilline's, this race has gotten tighter. Brendan Doherty was up by 15 points in our poll in February. Let's use your poll. He's up by 4 points. How did your campaign lose double digits in 6 months?
Well, you know, I think this is one of the advantages of having a primary. David Cicilline had 7 weeks of television where his opponent didn't go up on television. Brendan was out in the field every day, going to senior centers, meeting people throughout the 1st District. But our plan was always to go up on television in September, and ultimately television moves numbers. And David Cicilline had 7 weeks of that. But we're up on television now, and we think that the only poll that's going to count in this race is November 6th, and we're confident in that one.
So you say with the primary that helped out David Cicilline. Do you think Anthony Gemma helped out David Cicilline?
Well, you know, I think not running a traditional campaign against David Cicilline, not going on television, not doing significant radio advertising, not focusing on the issues at hand. I think it did help David Cicilline focus his attention on us, on Brendan Doherty, as opposed to focusing his attention on responding to Anthony Gemma and really pointing out where David Cicilline is going to be able to move this country forward.
Cicilline's ads actually targeted Republicans more than they targeted Mr. Gemma. Do you feel that there was a tactical mistake allowing him to have 7 weeks of attacking the Republicans and what they stood for without answering it?
You know, I really don't. And here's why. I think David Cicilline, over the past however many weeks it has been, where he's focused on Republicans, has really furthered the narrative of David Cicilline. Now, that narrative began in 2010 when, let's be honest, he lied to the voters in order to get elected. People know that. Now, in 2012, what we're seeing is that he's misleading on Brendan Doherty's position, but he's also focusing on Republicans versus Democrats. And the more he does that, the more he illustrates himself as Washington, D.C. personified. Gridlock personified, and that's what is holding this country back.
Now, Ian, the big critique I keep hearing from Democrats, even ones who aren't that thrilled to be voting for David Cicilline, is the only vote that matters is for Speaker of the U.S. House, and Brendan will vote for John Boehner. And even if Brendan Doherty doesn't support a lot of the issue positions that Boehner and the more conservative Republicans take, they'll be able to pass it because they're in charge because of Brendan's vote. How do you respond to that critique? This is a Democratic district in the end.
Well, you know, I disagree that that is the most important issue. I think the most important issue is, can you trust your representative? This is a representative democracy. The only thing you can do is send somebody to Washington that you can trust to do what's right on your behalf. And there's going to be thousands of votes. And the issue is, can Rhode Island count on Brendan Doherty to vote in the best interest of the people of Rhode Island? And I think the answer, and I know the answer, is absolutely yes.
But casting a string of no votes while the Republicans pass the bills that he says he opposes, in the end, he helped them be in charge to pass them.
Well, I think the reality of the matter is that, or the fact of the matter is that the Republicans are going to be in charge of the House. And I think that, you know, I've seen the DCCC, I've seen some of the Democratic talking points talking about, well, we have a chance to regain the House. They don't have a chance to regain the House. They have the slimmest of chances to regain the House. The reality is Republicans are going to control the House of Representatives. And it's better to have somebody in the majority party that can get the ear of leadership, that will be able to stand up for Rhode Island, as opposed to having somebody in the minority party who will not be able to get the ear of leadership and essentially will be a wasted vote.
Ian, let's take a moment here and play a recent campaign ad from Congressman Cicilline. I want to get your reaction to it, and it kind of gets to the heart of what Ted was talking about and the tack that David Cicilline is taking here. So let's take a listen to this.
I'm David Cicilline, and I approve this message.
What does Brendan Doherty think of Mitt Romney?
I think he'd be fantastic for Rhode Island.
Fantastic for Rhode Island? Doherty and Romney both want to repeal Obamacare, increasing drug prices for seniors. On abortion, they're both anti-choice, and they both oppose the Buffett rule, requiring millionaires to pay at least the same tax rate as the middle class. Brendan Doherty is wrong about Mitt Romney.
I think he'd be fantastic for Rhode Island.
And wrong for
Congressman David Cicilline, let's get your response to that.
Let's talk about the issues. Obamacare. They talk about repealing Obamacare, raising drug prices for seniors. What they're talking about is the piece of Obamacare that closes the Medicare Part D donut hole. Brendan Doherty has already been on record several times saying he would not repeal Obamacare unless that provision was still in place. That's misleading. Opposing the Buffett rule. Brendan Doherty has talked about Simpson-Bowles and the tax plan from Simpson-Bowles. Under Simpson-Bowles, millionaires and billionaires would pay a higher effective rate. The Buffett rule is just another layer on our already complex tax code. Brendan Doherty wants to embrace Simpson-Bowles and the fair, comprehensive tax reform that's in that. As far as the anti-choice, look, this is an issue that people aren't going to agree with. You have pro-choice people, you have pro-life people. That's an issue where you're not going to get people coming over to the other side. Brendan Doherty understands it's a complex issue, and it's not something we're going to agree on. So let's focus on the areas we can agree, and let's move this country forward.
In the last tax returns release, Mr. Romney paid, 14%. Does Mr. Doherty think that's enough payment, 14%, or what loopholes would he close of Mr. Romney's that Mr. Romney takes advantage of?
Well, I think you really need to take a look at the marginal rates. You need to take a look at the tax expenditures.
Well,
you need to take a look at the capital
Romney,
gains rate.
does he think Mr. Romney paid enough taxes?
No, I think that what we need to do is we need to focus on, like I said, Simpson-Bowles, right? It lowers the marginal rates, and by doing that, it's able to look at the capital gains rate and tax capital gains at that lower marginal rate. So
and
you're
at
not
the
going to have
abortion
that
issue,
special.
that's
Sure.
also in that ad. As you know, what the Republicans do is incrementalism. They, your candidate said, "Oh, I'm not going to vote to reverse Roe v. Wade." Well, that's not what the Republicans are proposing. They're proposing incremental changes like forbid abortion at the last trimester. Would Mr. Doherty vote to forbid abortion in the last trimester?
He will vote for bills that are within the confines of Roe versus Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood.
Well, what about that question? That decision left it open. It was the first 6 months that it really
As far
addressed.
as partial birth abortions in the last trimester?
Just the last trimester. 7, 8, or 9 months being is what some Republicans are trying to do.
Well, if the life of the mother is at stake, no.
But he would, short of that.
Short of that?
Yes, because as you know, people can elect to have an abortion.
Right, yes. Short of that, yes. Life of mother, health of mother, no.
I talk to Republicans often, and some of them are getting antsy now. They see on television every day your man getting hammered by David Cicilline, and then they see his ad, which is positive, but they feel like they're not seeing that critique of a very damaged incumbent. What's your message? What are you telling your supporters who feel worried that their man's getting attacked and isn't really attacking back?
I'd go back to that. It was the Revolutionary War saying, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Well, for the past 7 weeks, David Cicilline has defined himself, as I said earlier, as somebody that misled in 2010, and now he's misled in 2012.
I don't know, Ian. I think he's defined your candidate pretty effectively over the past, some would say at least over the past few weeks, and that's sort of what Ted is asking here. Have you allowed the congressman to define Brendan Doherty?
Again, I disagree. I respectfully disagree that he has defined us. It is still September. October is going to be where the election's won, and I think you're going to see a very different television advertisement next week, at the beginning of October.
Some of the Democrats are saying that at this point, Bill Fisher had a comment, the spokesman for the Rhode Island Democratic Party, to Tim on primary night, that basically the Providence issue is old hat. There's been enough talk about it for the last 2 years. It's been litigated, and it's, voters care, but they've heard enough about it. What do you make of that?
Well, here's who is not old hat too: the teachers that were laid off, the firefighters and police officers that had their benefits cut, the children whose schools got closed, the police officers on the street that have a reduction in force because they can't afford to put enough police on the streets to fight the crime. So it may be old news for the people that want to make it old news, but it's definitely not old news to the people that count.
When are we going to hear about his job plan with specificity? He talks about crumbling infrastructure. Well, what does he intend to do about it? How much money would be involved? How many jobs would that create?
That's a great question. And actually, we have something that we haven't figured out the date next week, but we're going to be having a press conference next week. We're going to talk about specifics, the difference between what our proposal is and what David Cicilline's proposal is, which is his block grant program.
I'm curious how you prepare Brendan Doherty for debate. We have debate coming up next month, Channel 12, between Brendan Doherty and Congressman Cicilline. How do you get him ready for that?
Well, for the past several months, I've been debating him. We've had different moderators.
So you play David Cicilline?
I play David Cicilline.
Who plays me and Ted?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, yesterday, and somebody that's going to be helping us out a little bit is one person that I believe debated David Cicilline pretty successfully, and that's John Laughlin. And John Laughlin sat in debate prep yesterday, and he had some great insight, and we look forward to continuing.
That was a memorable debate at PPAC we had 2 years ago with John Laughlin and David Cicilline for sure. You know, in March, Brendan Doherty sat in this studio, and you're shaking your head here. You were here. He struggled with some policy stuff. There's no easy way to say it. Then you got hired. How have you handled that with him?
Well, I've had more full-time opportunities to deal with policy on a daily basis, on a weekly basis.
What does that mean?
Every
Lock
chance
him in a
we get.
room? And I mean, honestly, how do you tackle? There's some big-time stuff for a guy who's just dipping his toes into congressional issues.
Brendan is a learner by doing, and it's repetition. And the more we talk about it, the more we, you know, sit down, go through different proposals, budget proposals, tax proposals. You know, I'm fully confident that when the debates come, he's going to surprise some people.
The website talks about the fact he wants a regulatory super commission to then excise regulations that are no longer relevant. How can you possibly do that? There's just so many things, like from FDA to securities fraud to banks that need regulating. How can like one commission understand the nuances of each one of those industries?
Well, that's interesting. Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, Democratic senator from Virginia, is actually somebody that's sort of leading the charge in regulatory reform, and he has a bunch of different ideas that, you know, speak about the one-in, one-out rule, or having independent agencies take inventory. I think what we need is a scoring provision. We have the Congressional Budget Office, which scores bills. I think we need a regulatory office, and Brendan, you know, that would score bills, regulations as to their economic effect. Now, depending on which estimate you read, regulations could affect the economy anywhere from $88 billion to $1.75 trillion a year. So the idea is to take a look at the economic effect, score those, and anything that has $100 million or more, I think it's $100 million or more, effect on the economy would have to pass through Congress as to the typical rulemaking procedure through the agencies.
Well, that's
so
half of it, though, right? What about the existing regs? Because it
well, that's
seems
where
to
the
imply...
agencies, that's where the agencies themselves, and I think President Obama is also a proponent of this, the agencies themselves have to take a look back and inventory those rules, those regulations, how they affect the economy, and produce reports upon, on how they affect the economy. That will allow us to really, you know, take inventory of that and decide what's helpful.
So it wouldn't be a super commission.
No. It wouldn't be a super commission.
You can change that on the website.
A lot of people think Mitt Romney has hit a few speed bumps lately. Political pundits say this has hurt Republicans down ticket. How has it impacted this race, and have you had to switch gears because of what's happened in the presidential campaign?
I don't think we've had to switch gears at all. I think this election is going to offer an interesting choice. This is sort of the control experiment here. Are Rhode Islanders going to elect somebody that's a partisan Democrat that he has problems with the truth?
Yeah, but
or
hang
somebody
on.
that's an independent individual.
At the top of the show, you said the slide in polls was because David Cicilline had a primary opportunity and he was able to get his message out during that time. You didn't mention the presidential campaign at all. Are you saying that your campaign is not feeling the weight of what some say has been a pretty dicey race by Mitt Romney?
I think we're always going to feel the weight of a presidential election when it's, 2012, 2008. But I think Brendan Doherty is enough of an independent-minded person of integrity, we're going to be able to push past that, regardless of what the presidential race has as an effect on
How
on
about
this
the
race.
weight of Mr. Obama? As you know, he was in the 60s during the last election. There also was a big Democratic turnout when there was a gambling question on as a referendum. We have that same now. What exactly is your campaign doing to at least court the minority vote in the state?
Well, that's, you know, Brendan Doherty, as Colonel of State Police, was always involved in community service, whether it was coaching basketball up at Chad Brown, whether it was working in the inner city in South Providence. So, you know, he has ties to those areas, and he's been on the ground, he's been speaking with leaders, community leaders, and he's there every night, you know, whether it's East Providence, Pawtucket, Chad Brown, South Providence. I'll be honest with you, he feels more comfortable going door to door in Chad Brown than he does in some other areas of the state. So, you know, this is an area where I think he's very comfortable, and I think we will get support.
Ian Pryor, campaign manager for Brendan Doherty, I want to thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, when we come back, it is a hot race, I should say, in House District 58, Pawtucket. Our guest is Carlos Tobon. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers.
Is he
Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. I'm joined by, on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and Eyewitness News analyst Arlene Violet. Our guest for the second half is candidate for state representative in House District 58, that's Pawtucket, Carlos Tobon. Carlos, thank you for joining us in the program.
Tim, Ted, and Arlene, thank you very much for having us.
I do, like on the first half, I want to point out that we invited Representative William San Bento to join us, but he tells us there was a scheduling conflict and that he had to decline the offer. For the people at home who maybe haven't picked up the Providence Journal or seen the other coverage on this, briefly get everyone up to speed on this. What happened in your race and what's happening right now?
Well, what we thought would be a simple race, people going out, voting, turned out to be a dead heat of 544, 543. That's what we have so far. I'm not one to think of conspiracies. However, when we asked for the recount, my attorney George Hovarth and his wife Margaret Hovarth, what they did is we looked through all the numbers and we tried to get as much information that was allowed to us. Unfortunately, they hold back certain things that are public information.
Being the Board of Elections?
Board of Elections, yes. And so we came across that, and in reading transcripts from other races, Fung, Larissa, Alves, and we saw that it was hard to get certain information. So we pushed as much as we could, and we knew that because of those cases, what we could get.
What kind of information is hard to get?
Let's say certain Excel sheets that were available before on the website, you need a special program. So those were provided to us by Ken McGill at the Pawtucket Board of Canvassers. In regards to the mail ballots, there's a rogue ballot that has turned this into one of the hot issues. There were precinct 2604 Nathaniel Green. There was 284 people who went to vote. There were 285 ballots cast. So we have a rogue ballot, and we asked to see the mail ballot, the applications to make sure that they were counted properly. And yes, in fact, yesterday there was an internal audit that was not made public, that they happened to do that precinct first, and they discovered that was confirmed.
We were talking before the show, and there's sort of an important question here that we need answered, because as you lay all this out, and understand we're in the wake of a pretty heated Cicilline-Gemma campaign, yes, and there was allegations of voter fraud, so that is on people's mind out there. Do you think, with all this, that you feel you're being blocked from information, some weird things are happening, do you think it's nefarious, i.e. it was voter fraud, or do you think it's just more of a mismanagement sort of thing happening on the end of the state?
It's hard to pinpoint. It's hard for me to make accusations. What I do know is that in past races, they always talk about a 1% margin. That could be 10 or 100 votes. This is one vote. And so these things come to light. So if this was happening all along and people just overlooked it or even dismissed it, 1 or 2 votes would not make a difference in most races. But the whole election is riding on this.
On one vote.
So you don't blame your opponent for any of these irregularities. You think it's the process?
I believe that if the average Rhode Islander was to look further into maybe the relationship between Mr. Cando and Mr. San Bento, you might question things.
Do you question things? That's the question.
Well, in the middle of the hearing, I saw Mr. Cando get up on several occasions, go up to Mr. San Bento, you know, grab his cheek and smile. That didn't give me too much comfort.
Yes.
You know,
That would be Bob Cando, who's the head of the
Yes.
Board of Election,
Yes.
Executive Director. Carlos, I want to understand, what are you're now, the ACLU has come in, they're going to assist you because it's expensive to
Yes.
hire lawyers and go. What will be the ACLU's request and your request to the Rhode Island Supreme Court?
well, at this time, what we've been fighting for the whole time was a manual recount. Under the 14th Amendment, basically it guarantees everybody's vote is equal. And at this time, because of that rogue ballot, it's not equal, because we can't just say, all right, let's grab the first 284 people who voted. No, well, there's one person who will not be counted, and that's not fair.
With that ballot, are you talking about Kathy Gregg from the Province Journal has been doing some very fine reporting on this.
Unbelievable.
There's one mail ballot, and correct me if I'm wrong, to an 83-year-old woman that was not counted. Is that the one you're referring to?
No, that happens to be the mail ballot that yesterday, after they did their internal audit and confirmed that there was a rogue ballot in precinct 2604, they also came back and took her off a list. There was initially 60 mail ballots that were sent out, 60 mail applications, and she was on that original list. Now she's off of it.
And her son told the Providence Journal that she voted for you.
Yes.
What was your reaction when you heard that?
Comforting.
Yeah, it's always good to hear.
What about the gentleman that had his name reversed and they sort of put him aside? What's your position on that?
Well, what I did in the last weekend when I was able to get this list, I went personally to these 10 people who were outstanding. One of them was in Afghanistan. I'm sure you guys read the paper, the people know. But Matar Solshet, he's the gentleman, the African gentleman who I sat down with him, we spoke, and we tried to figure it out. It was, yes, he put his last name, his first name on the last name and vice versa. I've spoken with several people from different Board of Canvassers. What they look for, the most important thing is match of signature and date of birth. So anyone can make an honest mistake. The truth is that, you know, could that have favored me or not? I'm not sure. He doesn't remember. But it's not a reason to take him completely out of the contest.
There were 6,900 voters, I did a count, eligible to cast ballots in the primary, and only about 1,087 or so showed up. You know, very, very low turnout. Why do you think that is?
It's actually very consistent with the primaries of that district. Historically, they usually go up by 100 or 2.
But which raises the broader question of just why, you know, when you were out talking to people, was it apathy? Did people not realize there was a race? What do you think's happening on the ground? You were on the hustings.
It's a combination of things. First of all, like I said, the last presidential race, there were 2 years ago when I ran and I lost by a little over 100, 1,200 people came out. This time, a little under 1,200 came out. First of all, the primary voters are your professional voters. These are the people who read the Valley Breeze, they read the Times, they read the Journal, they read, and they are well informed about their the candidates. What I've talked to a lot of people is, you know, Mr. San Bento built a solid base of approximately 454 people in 20 years. We inspired 453 people in 2 months, and I said, I think that says a lot because we walked. I talked to hundreds of people. I knocked on hundreds of doors. I made hundreds of calls. And, you know, you get the wink, you get the nod, you get the yes, I'm going to go. At the end of the day, you get the professional voters who go. And a lot of people want to change. And for me, it was very clear that when I knock on a door and I introduce myself, I say, hello, my name's Carlos Tobon, and I'm running for state representative. And they say, oh, hey, nice to meet you. I'm like, well, have you met your representative? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, well, what if I told you he's been there for 20 years and he's asking you to allow him to represent you once more? They're like, really? Well, who is it? And I'm like, well, what if I told you he has an insurance guy? Oh, the insurance guy. I'm like, so wait a minute, after 20 years, you're still the insurance guy and not the representative.
So with the, just about a minute left in the program, can you point to any votes that Representative San Bento has taken or anything he's done that was not in the best interest of the people of that district?
Well, he voted for 38 studios. He has been.
That's an easy one to say, hindsight 2020, don't you think?
Let's throw that one out.
Okay.
You know, why not? Second of all, he's been the biggest proponent behind the expansion of Twin River. You know, I respect that position, but I think that the people of the district deserve a lot more representation than that sole issue. When he claims that he was part of the funding formula, well, he's been there for 20 years. In 1996, the last one expired, and it took him 15 years to co-sponsor or be a part of it. Anyone can co-sponsor. Let's face it. You know, so the truth is that when he was sending out his information in the mailers, it was an exaggeration of the truth. It looks really nice, but let's go in there and let's talk about when was the last time you introduced legislation that you produced and it benefited the people of the
Carlos,
district.
as we're wrapping up the show, 20 seconds left. If you do not win this time around, are you going to run again?
There's a possibility. I mean, I want people to be the judges of what's happened, and if they believe that I could be their representative, I'll do it.
Carlos Tobon, District 58 candidate for state representative, thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching. If you missed any of it, it's online, WPRI.com. I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week.